In 1871, the Royal Navy took delivery of the Ant-class gunboat HMS Bonetta. More than half a century later, she sank in a gale off Staithes on a bitterly cold night in February 1934. The crew was saved in a dramatic rescue by the Brunswick lifeboat, but there was to be a high price for this heroism. She sank as a salvage vessel under the new name Disperser. Rumour had it that 12 sets of diving helmets went to the bottom with her. Modern-day divers have been keen to find the wreck, but she wasn't where the record said she would be. Why was this relatively modern shipwreck still a mystery? How could the Disperser remain so elusive?
This is Brunswick, a few miles up the coast from Whitby. The lifeboat station behind me is closed now, but it was active for more than 100 years. In 1934, this was home to the brand new lifeboat, the Always Ready.
This is Staithes, 3 miles up the coast from Brunswick and once home to the legendary Captain Cook. The lifeboat station behind me dates back to 1875, and when the Brunswick station closed, all the history, skills and tradition were brought here. And what's more, it's still operational to this day. Back in 1934, the lifeboats weren't quite so advanced as the one behind me. At Brunswick, the oil-powered Hester Rothschild was replaced with the first engine-powered boat. This was the Always Ready. The Always Ready was a 35-foot-long Liverpool class. She was powered by a single 35 horsepower Whitby petrol engine, which gave her a top speed of around 7 knots.
In 1934, life at sea was still a very risky business. Radio was only on the largest of ships, weather forecasts were poor, and navigation still relied heavily on the compass. Between the rivers of the Humber and the Tees lay the Yorkshire coast, a rugged coastline offering little refuge to shipping. To make matters worse, the ironstone in the cliffs deviated the compass, making foggy conditions extremely dangerous. All this meant plenty of action for the local lifeboat crews.
It was the 7th of February 1934, and at 3:30 in the morning, distress flares were seen 5 miles northeast of Staithes. Word passed down the coast, and the brand new Brunswick lifeboat, the Always Ready, was launched at 4:30. At the helm was her coxswain, Robert Patton. There was a west-norwesterly gale, and it took the lifeboat over an hour to reach the scene. When they arrived, they found the tug Trover standing by the sinking steamer Disperser. The tug skipper had managed to get 7 of the crew off the sinking vessel, and only the disabled cook Eglin remained on board. It appeared that the Disperser would sink at any moment, and so Patton manoeuvred the lifeboat alongside, and Eglin lowered himself over the gunwale. As a wave brought the vessels together, it was Patton who grabbed the man, but Eglin still clung to the Disperser, and as the next wave moved the boats apart, Patton was left with the split-second decision: let go or hang on. He chose to hang on. Both men were pulled into the sea. They were now caught between the heaving hulls as they banged together. Miraculously, Eglin was pulled out unscathed. Patton had not fared as well. He had been caught 3 times and had taken the full force of the blows. The Disperser had all but sunk as the lifeboat left, and all speed was made to return to Brunswick and get the injured man ashore. Patton was suffering from severe internal injuries, but he was a strong man and he fought for life. There is a saying amongst fishermen that the sea gives up its dead after 9 days, and strangely, Robert Patton hung on to life for 9 days before he finally died from his injuries.
Oh, Bob was a wonderful character, physically tall, commanding, fit as a fiddle, permanently bronzed, flashing smile and sparkling eyes, always cheerful. He came to our house regularly on a Saturday evening, and we sat, my brother and I, enthralled. It was, I suppose it was hero worship. The village just simply went dead. Fishermen could hardly be bothered to go to sea, and the institute was dead, and the whole village just seemed to lose its vitality. My father, he wrote to the donors and asked for permission to rechristen the boat. Robert Patton, she was named Always Ready originally, and the donors said yes, we could call her Robert Patton, but we had to retain Always Ready. So she was christened Robert Patton, the Always Ready, and that couldn't have been a better memorial, because that was Robert Patton, always ready to do a good turn. And the Princess Royal came to christen the boat, and she said how pleased she was to be able to christen a boat that had done work already. She was very, very sorry about the tragedy, but she felt honoured to be able to name the boat Robert Patton, Always Ready. He was awarded the gold medal of the institution, which is the equivalent of the VC, posthumously, of course, and his widow and my mother and father all went down to London, where she was presented with this medal, and he brought it all back. His friends, including my father, carried his coffin up the old Brunswick bank. Shoulder high in the villages in those days was a real honour, and to be carried up Brunswick bank was something very special. One of the old fishermen said to me, "We're like a ship without a rudder, without Bob."
The Disperser has always been of interest to divers. The reason for this is that the rumours said she was a salvage vessel on her way to a job off Margate, and that she had 12 hard hats on board when she sank. We found the names of the 8 crew, and there was one man listed as diver, and his name was George Frater, and he was from Whitby. So we followed up that clue, and with nothing to lose, we rang up all the freighters in the local phone book, and we got lucky. He had 2 sons living in the area, and we went to see both of them, and they confirmed that their father's diving gear went down with the wreck on that night. So now we knew for certain there was at least one hard hat on board.
So, why hadn't anyone found the wreck? The events of that night were well documented in the press and lifeboat records. The lights from both vessels were seen from the narrow inlet at Stays. The lifeboat had steamed from Brunswick for an hour to reach the scene. These facts dictated a fairly precise search area. Why hadn't 20 years of diving located the site?
The breakthrough came while we were doing some research in Hartlepool Library. We found an obscure press report, and in this report there was an extract from the log of the tug Trover. What it said was that after the lifeboat had left at 5:30 in the morning, the Trover had stood by the flooded hull of the Disperser, as not much of it was visible, and it was a hazard to shipping. The tug remained with her until 9:15 in the morning, when she finally went down. So the lifeboat record had been wrong. Disperser had floated for another 4 hours. This press report had been overlooked, and it changed everything.
It was clear to us now that the wreck of the Disperser would be several miles south-east of where everyone had expected to find her. We set to with tidal information and wind direction, and with some basic dead reckoning on the chart, we soon plotted a new search grid. Now what was needed was some settled weather to dive our way around all the wrecks we had located in the new search area.
Our first chance to put the plan into action was the summer of '95. It was an ideal summer. It was really settled and best remembered for the heat wave and the hosepipe bans. We started diving our target wrecks, and the best of them turned out to be a steam trawler, the Mary Islington, and we recovered the bell off her and brought to light an interesting story from the First World War. By the end of the summer we'd dived 4 of our possibles without any success, and it was really disappointing. Now we had to face yet another winter, still not knowing if we were on the right track.
It was the summer of '96. We'd done our few workup dives, we'd got ready, and we'd decided it was a good time to go out and do one of our target wrecks. It wasn't the hottest one we'd come across because the length was a little bit longer than we'd thought the Disperser should be, but we didn't let that put us off and we carried on. I remember it was a very beautiful day, it was very calm, clear, mid-afternoon, so the sunlight was penetrating very well. It was a 56 metre dive. I particularly remember the excitement of that day and not taking for granted that it was very deep, a bit of apprehension there, but all that seemed to go away. As we got down the line, it was incredibly clear visibility at that particular time, and then coming forward out of the gloom was this distinctive I-beam that we'd seen previously on photographs, which had actually showed it over a wreck at Amble, doing a salvage job, and that gave us a clear idea what the forecastle and this twin I-beam looked like with a pulley over the end. And then lo and behold, as we came down, that came into view. Andy and myself were sort of like, the anchor had gone over that part of the bow, and that brought us to the fact where we ended up on the forecastle. We knew exactly what we'd found, and we sort of looked at one another with big grins and shook hands, and it was like, well, here we go. Let's explore it and see what we can find. As we started to explore, Andy went straight to midships and started exploring around the engine and boilers. That was an interesting area because we knew that it would have twin screws, which was quite unusual for a steam vessel. Myself, I ended up going into the cuddy under the forecastle itself, which was very intact, thinking that would be a place where things could be stored. And indeed, for a few moments, I thought I'd found what we were looking for, because I found this sort of distinctive copper shade well into the silt. By the time I'd pulled it out, I couldn't see what was happening because of the dispersed silt and things. But it turned out to be a very nice mast headlight, very intact, very coppery. It's understandable how it could confuse someone. And then the next thing I heard was another lifting bag being filled in the distance, and Andy had actually found the bell.
We visited the wreck several times in '96, and the tiny site saw at least 20 man dives. We recovered several small artefacts, but nothing that belonged to the hard hat diver. We had lots of other new wrecks to explore, and the team were hungry for fresh excitement, and so reluctantly we moved on. It felt like we'd struggled through an endless jigsaw, only to find that the last piece was missing.
The Disperser started her life in 1871 as an experimental gunboat in the Royal Navy. She was one of 20 built as the Ant class, and she was named HMS Bonetta. These third-class gunboats were built for coastal and estuary defence and were fitted with a large 10-inch gun and manned by a complement of 30 men. The strategy was that a flotilla of these little vessels, like ants, could overwhelm a larger prey such as a battleship or cruiser. The problem with the design was they were relatively slow, only 7.5 knots, and not particularly seaworthy. Because of the stubby hull and low height, they were known as flat irons. All this gave fear to the Admiralty that these little boats would not be effective in heavy weather. Eventually this design was superseded by new ideas about defending Fortress Britain. A few of the Ant class were converted by the Navy into salvage vessels. The Bonetta was one of these, and she was renamed Disperser. By 1909, the Navy had no more use for her, and she was sold off along with a number of others for around £900 each.
It was 2001 before we eventually returned to the wreck site, and on the first dive, as soon as we hit the bottom, it was obvious that the site had changed. The wreck had deteriorated further, and now the tide was washing over areas that had previously been sheltered. The result of this was that the silt levels had dropped, and more things were exposed. The bow section was still intact. It had been reinforced to support the big gun. But as we left it heading aft, the hull plating had just fallen away to nothing. As we got to amidships on the starboard side, there were 3 frames and a gunwale still standing, and then inside of this there was timber decking. Now it turns out that this section of the boat was reinforced because it used to be the old shell room from when she was a gunboat. Now it was close to the boiler where it was warm and dry, an ideal place for storing the munitions, but also an ideal place for the diver to store his gear. I was swimming over the shell room, and shining my torch down through the gaps in the decking, I could see red hose. I put my hand down and moved some of the coils, and there, staring back at me, was an emerald green wingnut. I moved my hand around the shape, and I could feel a curved plate. I tried to move it, and it came slightly, but then the whole thing just disappeared in a cloud of silt. The dive was over, I was out of time, and it wasn't conclusive. I couldn't be certain it was the helmet. Looking back now, I was fairly sure, but my head just wouldn't let me accept it. I'd been disappointed too many times before. It was a really tense time after that. There were other diving teams in the area, and we were being watched. The next weekend the wind was strong, and so no one got out diving. 2 weeks later we got back to the site, but the echo sounder failed on us, and we couldn't find the wreck. Unbelievably, on the next trip the GPS failed, and we'd had gearbox problems in the harbour. If I was superstitious, I'd have come to the conclusion that someone didn't want us to find it. Everyone was uneasy, but we pressed on regardless, and finally we got back to the wreck.
It took every bit of concentration and focus to make that dive, and everything was planned to the last detail. Within minutes of hitting the seabed, we knew it was a full helmet, and we got on with the risky business of lifting it. In a few minutes the debris was clear, and it was out of its hole, free of the hoses, standing upright and ready for the lift. The colours were amazing. The copper had been preserved in the silt for years, and it looked almost as good as the day it was lost. couldn't relax until it was back in the boat and all in one piece. After almost 70 years on the seabed, it finally made it back to the surface. It's not possible to describe the mental relief at that point. The jigsaw was now complete.
This is it. There's some history here. This is George Freighter's diving helmet. This is what every diver wants. This is how they used to do it.
Still adjusts. Can't believe it.
Just look at all this mud. It wasn't like this when we left them. Robert Patton was a true hero, and he received national recognition at the time of his death. But the memories of him and what he'd done were fading. As this story unfolded, we became determined to preserve that recognition.
The story also led us on a fascinating diving adventure that has lasted over 20 years. Not quite the trail to Spanish gold or pirate's treasure, but nonetheless satisfying and just as rewarding to resolve.
The artefacts from the wreck are very important, and they're now on display in Scarborough. Why are they so important? Well, as well as being unique, they're also a direct connection back through time to the events of that stormy night off Staithes.
These artefacts help bring history off the page and enable us to touch those events. But what's more important is that as long as they survive, the memory of Robert Patton and his heroic deeds will be preserved along with them.